Hey, that's one of my favorite scenes too, when Wolverine puts the claw to like his head and ching, he's like, "Bang, Chuck, you're dead." And Cyclops is like, I was like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I know exactly how long my claws
I know
are."
exactly my own length, if you know what I mean. Hey guys, taking a brief break to remind you to like and subscribe, as this will really help the channel out. Plus, hit the bell icon so you'll be notified so you don't miss any of our future videos. Welcome back, Geeks on a Leash. This is James, and rejoined with my buddy Jason, and we are again. Put it on mute, buddy.
Okay, it's on silent.
All right, welcome back, Geeks on a Leash. This is Sleeve It or Leave It again. As promised, back on every Wednesday. I have again Jason with me, and today we are going to be talking about a classic issue from 1991, X-Men, issue number 1. Chris Clermont, Jim Lee, powerhouse of the time for the comic books. Chris Clermont on the classic X-Men stories. This was one of his last stories before leaving the X-Men storylines. He did it all through the 80s, and this was one of his last stories in the 90s. And this was the last story. And then Jim Lee on art, one of the best comic book artists of his time, revolutionized a lot of stuff. So we're going to go through this comic and kind of give you a little step-by-step history of it and what the comic contained and whether we think you should sleeve it or leave it. So, all right. So the first off, we want to go over the history behind the issue. So Chris Clermont was coming to the end of his X-Men run. Not that he knew that at the time. It ended up being that Jim Lee ended up taking over as the comic head man for the storylines, but he didn't know this at the time. Chris Clermont thought he actually in an interview one time said he had a lot of storylines that would have continued on to the future past this point, past these first 3 issues. But the first issue, it was one of the number 1 selling issues. And if you remember, Jason, it had the 4 different comic book covers, and you could put them together, and it made that whole long scene. You remember that?
Yeah, the mural or whatever,
Yeah,
where they were all like coming up to Magneto. Yeah, that was pretty sweet. That was a great idea.
yeah. They had Magneto on the 4th issue. Yeah, the 4th issue, and then they had the 3 different issues. It had the one had Cyclops, Wolverine, Iceman on it. Another one had like Gambit and Rogue, and I don't remember who all else. And then the very last one had like Professor X, Jean Grey, and some of the other characters, and the Colossus.
All the plebs, the nerds.
All the plebs that nobody cared about.
Well, I don't know. I like Jean Grey. Wow.
But I remember that was that was a pretty bold move at the time. I mean, doing the 4 comic books where you actually had to go out and buy the same comic 4 times to get the entire thing. And then not only that, then they came out later, later in the month, they came out with the deluxe edition where it had a fold out one where you could fold out the back and fold out the front, and then it gave you all 4 of the covers all in one.
I do love my foldouts.
I don't have any comment at that, so we'll leave that one alone.
You dog, you.
It was literally like a reboot of the X-Men. They were trying to start it over, and they just recently had a reboot of Spider-Man with Todd McFarlane, a number 1. That they did that with kind of a reboot of the series, and they wanted to do something similar with the X-Men number 1. And so what they ended up doing was with X-Men, they actually created this number 1, having the multiple copies. You would have thought that it would have hurt sales, but it was their number 1 selling comic. Even today, no Marvel comic book has sold as many copies. It sold over 8 million copies of that particular issue. And then, if you remember, do you remember the opening scenes of that comic book, Jason? Magneto was tearing up their ships in that epic scene with him like hovering over Earth and tearing up their ships, and they're all floating in space at his mercy. Do you remember that epic scene?
Yes, because actually, what I found interesting was the fact that Magneto was not wearing a helmet and or a spacesuit, and I was just like, wait a minute, the dude doesn't need to breathe. The only thing I can surmise is he made a force field full of air and was like, I got this. No big deal.
I'll only be out here for 15 minutes or so. That was a crazy scene. I remember the acolytes sitting there screaming at him, which I didn't understand how they could hear him in space because he wasn't wearing a helmet, wasn't wearing any comm equipment or anything, but yet they still were able to hear each other.
I guess they don't need air for their sound waves.
Exactly. Well, he doesn't need air to breathe, so he doesn't need air for sound waves. So what's the point?
Telepathy.
But yeah, I remember the acolytes sitting there pledging themselves to him in space, and they're saying, "We've come to join your cause." And Magneto was resigned to just send them back to Earth and be like, you know what, I don't have a cause anymore. And if you remember before this, back in the 80s, Magneto had joined the X-Men because Professor X had, gone up to the Shi'ar Empire, found love, and was gone for several years. I think it was like 8 or 9 years, something like that.
Loser.
Yeah. So the power of the P attracts you away. So
That's right. Pull you away from your responsibilities.
yeah, it'll make you do crazy and nutty stuff. So
Nutty. I get what you did there.
nutty stuff. However, with Xavier gone, Magneto had changed. I mean, he was a totally different character, and he had actually become kind of like the head of the X-Men, leading the New Mutants. And was an ally. In fact, there's a whole comic book stream in the 80s of the X-Men versus the Avengers, the X-Men protecting Magneto against his past crimes, saying he had changed. So this was kind of like a role reversal. Like he was back at Asteroid M, had separated himself from the X-Men, and the acolytes came and were reinvigorating his past self of mutants having freedom from humans and being liberated and not having to deal with all the oppression that humanity was causing for mutant kind. So they were reigniting that in him. And then if you remember the next scene, I know you remember the next scene where they cut and it goes to the X-Men and we get introduced to the new X-Men team from the 90s. Tell us about your memories of that.
Well, I thought it was really cool because it was the first time that they introduced the two teams, and I thought it was kind of weird because I was like, the X-Men are fighting each other. What the heck is going on here? But they quickly introduced the fact that they were two teams and they were just practicing against each other in the danger room, and that they were trying to get to Professor Xavier to say who won. It was kind of like capture the flag type thing, but with Professor X. And that's one of the most iconic scenes, and I think that's what made me kind of fall in love with Wolverine in the beginning. Besides Hugh Jackman, wow, dreamy. No, just playing. What made me fall in love with him is the fact that he was such a beast. I mean, he was cutting through walls, and like the robots were all draped over him. And when he cut through the floor and he jumped up, he had like a robot wrapped around his body, and he just goes up to Professor X and like ejects his claws out, and ching, and he goes, "Bang, Chuck, you're dead." And then Cyclops, of course, gets all bent out of shape. You're gonna cut his head off, blah 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 blah, whatever. Adamantium in the head is apparently bad, whatever. But I loved the iconic vision of Wolverine. He's like, whatever, no big deal. I'm gonna light a cigar right now and start smoking it as Cyclops is, yelling at him. I was like, okay, Wolverine's a BA and he don't care.
Exactly. I especially love the scene with Wolverine, Psylocke, and Gambit in the sewers when they think they're being all sneaky, and Cyclops zooms in on them and like, hey, because the first team, Rogue, Iceman, Archangel, and Colossus, were coming in through like an aerial assault from and basically the danger room had changed. Danger Room was more like the holodeck from Star Trek, where it simulated everything. Instead of in the 80s, it was like they had to jump through rings and spikes would come at them and they had to dodge things. So it was more like an Olympic type, jump through hoops kind of thing. And this was like the Danger Room was the first time you've seen the Danger Room, and it was like the holodeck. And it was amazing. And that was like, I know they stole it from Star Trek because Star Trek did it first. But I mean, it was definitely a cool addition to the Danger Room, and making the Danger Room into like more of a holodeck, and that's what they were basically in. And what was really cool was that scene where, like, Cyclops catches Wolverine, Psylocke, and Gambit sneaking in, and then they get surrounded by all the robots, and they're just like, "Oh crap, we just got caught," and then they had to fight their way out of it. That was an amazing scene. I love that scene, and then of course Gambit goes off, tries to play lone wolf and try to capture the professor, and Wolverine went off and finally captured and got Professor X, as you said so dramatically, with his claws, the claw scene. So it was a great scene. It was, it definitely introduced the X-Men, and it combined the 80s X-Men. It took some of the X-Men out, like Havoc, Longshot, and Dazzler were no longer part of the team, but it brought in the old X-Force team or original X-Men and put them into the team. And the blue team consisted of Cyclops, Wolverine, Beast, Rogue, Psylocke, and Gambit, which that was my favorite team, honestly. And then the gold team was led by Storm, Jean Grey, Colossus, Iceman, Bishop, and Archangel. And then they also had Banshee and Forge that were kind of like their techie type people that were on deck as well. But they had a great team. This was like a powerhouse team, and this is like what the iconic 90s X-Men cartoon came was from this particular X-Men. We're gonna go ahead and move on from the actual Danger Room scene. The next thing that happened was, the next thing we see Magneto. He comes down to the Earth from his asteroid M, and he starts to raise a Russian nuclear sub. And if you remember, you might not remember, this was even before my time, 1960s, there was like an issue in 1963. I think it was a number Uncanny X-Men 150, I think is what it was. Anyways, I looked it up before this podcast. I'll have to double check my notes here. It says, yeah, Uncanny X-Men number 150. And Magneto had an island where he was basically doing the same thing, was trying to protect mutants, and a Russian sub came and was going to nuke the island, and basically Magneto sank the sub, and all the Russian sailors basically died inside the submarine. So he was raising this nuclear sub and started taking out the nuclear weapons. And of course, that puts the X-Men on high alert, and the blue team, the X-Men blue team, led by Cyclops, react to it. And I remember that whole scene. They get on the sub and they start talking to him. And they start off talking to him because, like you said, like I was saying before, they had been allies all through the 80s. And so they started talking to him and like, hey, what's going on here? Why are you raising these sailors? Trying to, and I remember Wolverine's sarcastic remark, hey, you're raising these sailors so you can give them a proper burial, or what's going on here? And then Magneto sits there and says, no, I sank this sub in self-defense, and now I raise it again in self-defense. And he was taking the nuclear missiles to protect Asteroid M in case anybody attacked him. And I remember them sitting there, the X-Men asking, what are you going to do if someone does you wrong, or does something you don't like? You're going to nuke them? We can't let you take these nukes. And so because they know that Magneto is about to take all these nukes, it escalates. And of course, the X-Men attack. Wolverine, of course, gets in his berserker rage and cuts him across the chest and slashes him. And Cyclops unleashes an energy blast on him. And finally, Magneto's like, you know what? This is enough. This is crazy. You X-Men, we were allies, and you guys are just treating me like a criminal, even though I'm taking nuclear weapons. So I don't know what your problem is.
Truth. You get mad, somebody takes the nuclear missile.
So someone's stealing a nuclear missile, the crime of the century, right?
Apparently, you get bent out of shape.
Whiny babies. So he takes off and he starts going into the atmosphere with the nuclear weapons, and Rogue chases after him. And Rogue tries to talk to him, and she actually starts to get to him for a little bit. And before it's completed, the Russians attack, and they actually attack because they see that they're raising a nuclear sub, and it's their Russian warheads. And the Russians attack and actually shoot Rogue in the back, and she falls to the earth. And so he gets mad. Magneto gets upset about it. And so what he decides to do is he just detonates a nuclear explosion inside the atmosphere and destroys the planes that were attacking, and he takes off with the rest of the nukes. So, of course, that doesn't end well because now he's got a bunch of nuclear weapons. The X-Men lost track of him. And so Rogue, they don't know where Rogue is. So you think, did Rogue get caught up in the nuclear explosion? Is she all right? You don't know what happened to her. And Magneto goes back and he goes and rests up and gets healed by Cortez, because Cortez has a power where he can heal and enhance Magneto's powers. That get into that more later on another issue, because Magneto actually starts getting addicted to the healing powers and the enhancement powers that Cortez has, and he becomes almost dependent on Cortez like a drug. Anyways, that's a different story. Just a little side note. So the next thing that you see is Rogue coming in and waking up on an island of Genosha, which, if you remember Genosha, I'm sure you remember from the cartoons, the 90s cartoon or the old 90s comics, The Extinction Agenda. Genosha was like a country where they enslaved mutants. First they tried to entice mutants to Genosha and saying, "Oh, if you want to come here, you'll be able to be free," and whatever. And then they would enslave them and use their powers to, do whatever, like build quarries and do this and do that. And so they actually were enslaving and even killing mutants. But anyways, what ends up happening is the acolytes start attacking, and Rogue wakes up and she starts trying to defend Genosha. And then the X-Men show up because they figure out where the acolytes have gone, and they start an epic battle and a fight scene. Yeah, and I'm sure you remember the crazy battle that ensues with them on Genosha. And I remember the acolytes sitting there saying, these people tried to destroy you. They've enslaved mutant kind. They've killed mutants, and here you are defending them. And I remember Gambit sitting there saying, hey, the government's changed. Yeah, they did some crimes. They did awful things, but now their politics have changed. We're not going to let you just hurt innocent people, just because, the past regime was evil. You can't just do this to the people of this island. They end up fighting, and the X-Men, of course, are more seasoned, more experienced, and they end up beating him. And the last scene of the actual comic, I'm sure you remember. I'll let you kind of discuss it. If you remember, Magneto coming down, and basically what he was telling them, like they were sitting there wanting to take the acolytes away, and you remember that scene where Magneto's just kind of standing over them all, like you're not taking my acolytes.
Yeah, and he has his shield like extended out, and his face just says, "Simmer down now."
Doesn't say simmer down now. He's got that grimace like, this is not happening. I am Magneto. I will.
Yeah, that's his simmer down now face. Simmer down now.
Oh, that's the simmer down face? Simmer down. Come on, X-Men. I ain't putting up with your B shit.
You best be simmering down now.
So, yeah, that was where it ended. Was Magneto? Basically, the X-Men are like holding them. They're like all defeated and beaten, and the X-Men are just kind of like standing back, like with the acolytes in hand, like we're taking these dudes with them. And Magneto sits there and stands over him and says, "The hell you are," And then they're like, "Well, they attacked Genosha, and they're like, they didn't get anything they didn't deserve from their past crimes. These people have pledged themselves to me. I'm not going to abandon them. And if you make me fight," Magneto's never been a proponent for fighting other mutants, but he was like, "If you make me,
I will destroy you."
Exactly. And that's how the comic ended. Great issue. I always love that issue. So now's the time. With this issue, would you sleeve it or leave it? Our motto is sleeve it, put it in the sleeve, the protective sleeve, and put it on your shelf and keep it. Or would you leave it on the store shelf if you saw it, and leave it in the store and not take it with you? What would you decide on this one?
Well, seeing how I actually own the issue and it's in my closet right now, I would have to say I'd have to sleeve it.
Definitely a sleeve-worthy issue, definitely. So, and I agree with you. I definitely love that issue. It is a great issue, and it is one of those issues that I grew up with and have fond memories of. The artwork of Jim Lee was epic, and it was the end of an era of Chris Claremont's storytelling, and it kind of the torch being passed on to Jim Lee and the other writers in Marvel, and Chris Claremont kind of retiring from the X-Men run, his greatest run. So it's definitely an issue that I recommend that other people go out and get. If you haven't read it before, go and find it. You can download it on Kindle, Amazon Kindle. Definitely a worthy X-Men comic. I mean, the X-Men comic nowadays, I just don't think they have the same impact and the same fire as those comic books back then. So I definitely love that issue.
It's true. I mean, just the artwork alone. It was the first time that they, went from like a newspaper looking artwork to the computer generated printing. And it just, it was night and day. It's like going from regular def to high def. Everything just was beautiful. It wasn't kind of matted down.
And it survived the test of time as well. Instead of it being like the newsprint, it started to fade out over time. The computer generated paper that they put it on, computer generated artwork they did. It still looks beautiful to this day. So
true, very true.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and wrap this episode up. Thank you for joining me, Jason. I appreciate you throwing in your 2 cents about this issue. And like and subscribe, of course, here on Ender Angel Comic Book Review, as well as visit us at Ender Angel Gaming. And also follow us on our podcast, Geeks on a Leash. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Google Podcast. Thank you guys, and see you later.
And remember, simmer down now.